Hi, welcome to part 3 on our subunit related to ancient Near Eastern art. In this segment, we're going to be looking at another group, the Babylonians. In our last segment, we looked at the Sumerians. And so, as I talked about in the introduction to ancient Near Eastern art, we'll see many different groups come to power. One group might fall, another might come to power, the other group might have a resurgence and come to power again. And so this really added to sort of the chaotic environment of the ancient Near East during this time period. So after the Sumerians, there was a group known as the Akkadians. After the Akkadians, there was a resurgence of the Sumerian that was very short-lived. And over the next 2 centuries, the traditional Mesopotamia political pattern of several independent city-states existing side by side reigned until Babylonians' most powerful king, Hammurabi, reestablished a centralized government that ruled Mesopotamia, or the ancient Near East. This is the work of art that we're going to be looking at. It's a Babylonian. It's known as the Stele of Hammurabi. Hammurabi of the city-state of Babylon, conquered much of northern and western Mesopotamia, and by 1776 BCE, he was the most far-reaching leader of Mesopotamian history, describing himself as the king who made the 4 quarters of the earth obedient. Documents show Hammurabi was a classic micromanager concerned with all aspects of his rule. And this is seen in his famous legal code, which we're looking at right here. It survives in partial copies, and it survives on the stele that is located in the Louvre. And this is done on clay tablets. Remember, a stele is a vertical stone monument or marker, often inscribed with text or with relief carving. In the pre-global unit, we looked at the anthropomorphic stele of the warrior. So this is something similar. When we look at this work, it really provides us with a view and a monument that is really presenting Hammurabi as an example of a king of justice. What is interesting about the representation of Hammurabi on the legal code stele is that he is seen receiving the laws from the god Shamash. So this is the god right here, and this is Hammurabi, and he's sort of receiving these laws from the deity. Shamash also has these thunderbolts, or something that looks like thunderbolts, around his shoulders. But the emphasis here is Hammurabi's role as a pious theocrat. Remember, a theocracy is this combination of government and religion. The two aren't separate. And the laws themselves come from God. So here we have, again, this idea of a ruler not being a deity or a god, but being an intermediary between his citizens and the gods. So some questions and themes that we should think about are: 1, how does the stele reinforce the power of the king? Remember, this unit is entitled, or the subunit is entitled, Power and Authority. And so really what we see here is this idea of investiture, investiture, and this is the gods granting a ruler the right to rule. And so this is a really important concept where we see, this idea of a divine right to rule, or that, a king's rule comes from heaven. And so this is a theme that we'll see in other historical periods as well. Here's another picture, just so you can get a sense of the scale. So it's rather large, it's over life size. And so you have this relief carving at the top, and then you have all these different laws, or this law code inscribed at the bottom. So Hammurabi was famous for his conquests, but best known for his law code, which prescribed penalties from everything from adultery to murder. The code is inscribed on a tall black stone. At the top is a relief carving depicting Hammurabi in the presence of the sun god Shamash. The god bestows on Hammurabi the authority to rule and to enforce the laws. the two figures, when you look at them, it's a really interesting dynamic that's unfolding, because in other works we've talked about this idea of hierarchic scale, and definitely a god would be portrayed much larger um, than anybody else in the composition, even a king. But here the figures seem equally visually equal. You have Hammurabi who's standing, and Shamash is seated. And this idea is that if Shamash were to stand up, he would be taller. And so this implies Shamash's greater importance as a god, but it also establishes Hammurabi's divine right to rule and enforce the law code. So here the artist was kind of in a predicament. Here he's trying to come up with a composition that reflects the power and authority of the king, but he also doesn't want to be disrespectful to the deity as well. So he's kind of caught in the middle, and I think this is a brilliant way to sort of establish that both these figures are equally important. So you have Hammurabi standing, you have Shamash seated, with this idea that if he stood up, he'd be taller. And so, it's really clever in the way he's sort of balancing the power between the king and the god. Um, so, an innovation that we do see here is this description, or this use of something called foreshortening. And it's this idea of an object sort of it seems like it's projecting into our space and gives us the illusion of depth. And so the bent arm of the god is sort of getting there. It's not quite foreshortening, but it's pretty close. And so this is considered a predecessor to this concept of foreshortening and suggesting the illusion of depth. Um, so again, on those organizers that I give you, those visual organizers, I talk about stylistic conventions and innovations. So some stylistic conventions would be this notion of hierarchy. Um, this figure's larger, this figure technically is smaller, if the god were to stand up. But this innovation too of maybe introducing this idea of foreshortening and really trying to suggest this illusion of space. All right, so our next group are the Assyrians. For most of the first half of the first millennium BCE, the Assyrians, who take their name from Assur, the city on the Tigris River in northeastern Syria, the Assyrians were a pretty fierce group. They were very much into warfare. They had a very rebellious nature, and the Assyrians were often described as being very cruel and a merciless people, whose atrocities and warfare were pretty horrible. I mean, they did not treat their conquered subjects very well. We'll see some of the art and architecture reflect this idea of war and being powerful and being fierce and being in charge and not showing mercy. So this is an example of a citadel, and it's known as the citadel and palace complex of Sargon II, who was the ruler during this period. And so this was a type of fortress, a citadel. Within the citadel, Sargon's palace was located in this structure. So you have this fortress, and then within this fortress, you have the living quarters of the king. And so this is where the king governed as well as resided. And this structure demonstrates the king's authority and is an example of art used as political propaganda. So this is a sub-theme in terms of this idea of our larger themes of power and authority. The citadel was guarded by 2 towers and accessible only by a wide ramp leading up from an open square around which the residence of important government and religious officials were clustered. And so this diagram, you can kind of see this. So it was very well protected. And this is a good example of how architecture has evolved in terms of, again, being a place of shelter, providing living quarters, but also, serving as an administrative and government building as well. The heart of the palace was protected by a reinforced wall with only two small doors off center. And so, again, the architecture reflects what was happening during this time period. So, again, I want to remind you that all these groups were constantly fighting each other and trying to gain power. And so, it would be natural that this type of fortress or this type of architecture would emerge. So, the heart of the palace was protected by this reinforced wall, and there would only be two doors, small doors off-centered that laid past the main courtyard. Within the inner complex was a second courtyard lined with elaborate narrative relief carvings, and we're going to take a look at some of these. Visitors of the king would have waited here to see the king in this courtyard, which also functioned as an audience hall. Visitors would access the king, would access the royal throne room by passing through a gate that would have been flanked also by these colossal guardian statues, and we're going to look at those as well. So not only is the structure itself a symbol of power and authority, and again this idea of propaganda, but the way it's decorated, the interior and the sculpture used also communicated this idea as well. So this is one of the relief carvings that a visitor would have to pass by. This isn't one of your required works, but it is an important one, and I think you should be familiar with it. And I think it really makes a connection with the building, the architecture of the citadel, and the program or the interior design of it, and really helps unify and connect those things. So this is a relief narrative. We've talked about narratives before, this idea of a narrative in relation to the standard of ore. So interior public reception rooms were lined with large-scale limestone relief carvings which displayed beautiful yet terrifying images of power and wealth of the Assyrian king. So what we're looking at here is Arsupanal II killing lions. So what we see here is a dramatic lion hunt depicted in low relief. And so this is a type of carving, and you should know these terms, okay, low relief. And it shows the king of Assyria killing lions in a ceremonial hunt. So this is an arranged hunt. He's not out in the wild. This relief was very typical of battle scenes and hunting scenes. And again, this functioned as a way to establish the king's authority. This particular set of reliefs was considered masterful, with dynamic yet naturalistic portrayals of figures, in particular the animals. So these were really exquisitely done. I mean, I think when we look at the figures, they're proportional, they're very elegant. There's still some stylized features, but they definitely are not as stylized as we've seen with the human figure in global prehistory and definitely with the Sumerians. And the animals are exquisite. Again, very naturalistic. This attention to their musculature and their sort of ferociousness in their expressions. Here we see, again, this idea of depth depicted with sort of the two horses and the doubling of the legs. And they really are considered some of the finest ancient relief carvings in the world. And so the symbol of the lion is very important in Mesopotamia culture. It symbolizes the violence of nature. So the killing of lions is an important symbolic act. It signals the king controlling nature and keeping it at bay, therefore keeping the city safe and protected. So again, the way we talk about pictures and how do we tell narratives and stories through pictures is through symbols like this and how they're arranged in a composition. The hunt being depicted would have been a fabricated one set in an arena. We can identify the king by his distinct crown he wears, and obviously he's depicted slightly larger than the other human figures, so there's that use of hierarchic scale. Animals are portrayed more naturalistically than the more rigid human figures. So the animals are definitely more fluid and natural, while the figures definitely are, they're definitely a little bit more rigid. Um, horses exhibit motion and resistance to being bridled, so it's almost like we can sense the straining of, this charioteer sort of pulling on the horse. And really, they're just, it's really amazing when you compare this to some of the earlier works that we've looked at in terms of how animals and humans are depicted. We can see other figures depicted off to the side to act as bearers, keeping the animal confined. So you see that over here. The immediacy portrayed in this image makes a shift in Mesopotamian art away from a sense of timelessness toward depicting a more dramatic emotional event. So when we think about the standard of or even the votive figures, there is this sort of timelessness. Here, when we look at this, it really does seem like an immediate event happening. And it definitely has that feeling associated with it, and why people love these relief carvings so much. And so, this becomes definitely a much more emotional and dramatic event than compared to the standard of ore, where you have this banquet scene and everything's, aligned in registers and everyone's, stiff and rigid, and it's definitely a different mood. This is another relief carving depicting Arsupanal and his queen in the garden. And again, this one is unusually peaceful. It depicts the king and queen relaxing in a pleasure garden. The king is reclining on a couch while the queen sits in a chair at his feet. There's a lyre player depicted on the far left entertaining the royal couple. And then we see 3 servants on the left arrive with trays of food, while other servants wave whisks or these kind of fans to protect the royal couple from flies. The king is, also portrayed as being informal. He's taken off his necklace and hung it on the couch. He has also laid down his weapons on a table beside him. And this is unusual. You would think, well, a king wouldn't want to be portrayed this way. Why is he doing this? And what you have to think about is that the tranquil scene is actually a victory celebration. If we look again to the far left, we see a horrific trophy in the form of a severed head from the enemy, and it hangs upside down from a tree. So here it is. So again, it's portraying the king, even though he's obviously relaxing, but it's still asserting his authority and power in a subtle way. And so the trophy serves as a reminder of the king's fierce display of power and authority. A reconstructive drawing of how this audience hall would have functioned. So here, visitors waiting to hold audience with the king would have to walk past these different relief carvings, and they were painted as well. And then to actually enter the main room, they would have to go by these fierce figures here, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So again, the interior program or interior design of this structure was very important. Every aspect of this building was about, communicating this theme of power and authority of the king. So here are 2 Lamasu, and these are kind of a composite creature. Neo-Assyrians, and so this is sort of Neo-Assyrian. So again, we have this, we have different groups falling and then gaining power again. And so this dates back to 720 BCE. And these are composite statues of guardian figures, and they were again known as Lamassu, Lamassu, and it combined a bearded head of a man, and most likely this was supposed to represent the king, the powerful body of a lion or a bull, the wings of an eagle, and then a horned headdress of a god. Now these are symbols that are very important in Mesopotamian culture, the lion in particular, and then we have seen a horned headdress before. Remember, we saw that with the running horned woman in pre-global history. So we can see these motifs being carried over. And these statues would have stood outside the palace courtyard gates while where visitors would have to pass before entering the throne room, um, before they were to hold audience with the king. These figures were thought of as border creatures or intermediaries between the secular and divine world. So they were kind of this gateway from a secular world, and then again, they're going in to be in front of the king, in the presence of the king who gets his rule through divine right. And so, it's natural that these would sort of be considered border figures. Here we see again a ruler aligning his identity and power with the gods. His authority comes from divinity. And all of this artwork is establishing that. This is another view of the Lama figure. So the figures were meant to be viewed from two perspectives. The viewer can see four legs on the side as they pass by, and two in the front as they approach the figure. So there's a total of 5 legs. And this shows the sculpture was meant to be viewed from multiple perspectives, the side and the front. This would make sense since the visitor would have to walk in between the two figures. So I want you to think for a minute and maybe write down some ideas, and we'll maybe open up class with this discussion. But how does this work convey power and authority? And how do the stylistic conventions reinforce these themes? So maybe, get out a sheet of paper and use that paradigm of art historical analysis, the cornflakes. Cornflakes make really funky pancakes, and see if you can break it down and sort of establish specifically how the content and the subject matter and the mood and where our attention goes to establish these themes. Stay tuned for part 5. We have one last work of art to look at. We'll be looking at the Persian Empire and another architecture building. So stay tuned.